Don't come back! Or you'll die!
I was speechless when I suddenly received a call from my husband while I was on an overseas business trip. His voice was filled with a sense of urgency. Then, he repeatedly said,
Do not come back to the country until I contact you.
Before abruptly hanging up the phone. What on earth is going on? No matter how much I thought about it, I couldn't figure out what he meant. The ominous message left me feeling crushed by anxiety and fear. I tried calling him back to get a proper explanation, but I couldn't get through. Little did I know at that moment what kind of situation was unfolding. I am Nancy, 35 years old. I worked as a technician at a major manufacturer. 5 years ago, I married my husband Jason, who worked in sales for a trading company, and we've been living together ever since. Even though we were often busy and our paths didn't cross much, the time spent with him in the home we built when we got married was the most important thing to me. I often thought about how much fun it would be when we had children. I also dreamed of expanding our house one day to bring our parents to live with us. My in-laws live far away, and since we couldn't visit them often, it was a constant worry for me. On the other hand, my parents live nearby and would sometimes come over to help with household chores, knowing how busy we were. I was always grateful to Jason for accepting their help without any complaints. However, my husband had his flaws. He would say,
Work relationships and hobbies cost money.
And spent all of his salary on himself. Despite my repeated warnings, he couldn't shake off his bachelor habits. We managed our living expenses with my salary, but since I was also saving for the future, the money I could spend freely was very limited. Then one day, my husband suddenly asked me to pay $20,000. What? Such a large sum of money? What for?
I became a guarantor for a friend.
He said.
But now I can't get in touch with him, so I have to pay.
I was shocked that he had become a guarantor without my knowledge, and I turned pale at the amount of $20,000. However, my husband remained unfazed. He then showed me a bank book and said,
We can use this to pay.
I froze when I saw the bank book. It was my account, where I had been saving little by little each month for when we had children. Wait. You can't use that. I've worked so hard to save it.
Why? There's no point in keeping money you won't use. You can't have kids anymore anyway, so it's just wasted money.
That's terrible. I was devastated by his cruel words and his mocking laugh. I couldn't stop the tears from flowing, and I was unable to say anything more. It hurt so much to have my efforts and hopes for the future dismissed. Jason didn't care that I was crying. He went into his study and ignored me for the rest of the night, not coming out until the next morning, despite my attempts to talk to him through the door. The next morning, after a sleepless night, I realized I couldn't let my husband have his way. I had to make sure he didn't use that savings. So, after Jason left for work, I went into his study to search for the bank book and card. But no matter how thoroughly I searched the room, I couldn't find them anywhere. Panicking at the thought of being too late, I called my husband, but he didn't answer. Eventually, I received a message from him saying,
I'm on a business trip and won't be back for a few days.
3 days later, when I returned home from work, I found the bank book and card carelessly left on the living room table. With a sense of dread, I quickly checked the bank book and saw that all the money I had saved had been withdrawn. How could he do this to me? I was heartbroken and furious, and I couldn't stop crying. Although I had been concerned about his extravagant spending, I had tolerated it because we managed to get by. But at that moment, my patience reached its limit. However, just when I thought we needed to have a proper discussion, I was assigned an overseas business trip. I was entrusted with a major project, and the duration was at least 1 month, possibly extending to 3 months. In addition to my usual work, my days off were often consumed by preparing for the trip. Meanwhile, my husband seemed to be deliberately avoiding me, and there were many days when we didn't see each other at home. In the end, without having the chance to talk things through with him, I left for my overseas assignment. A month and a half later, I was pleased to find that the work was progressing well, and I could return home earlier than expected. During my time abroad, my husband was often unreachable by phone, and our communication was limited to messages. Despite my lingering frustration with him, the pressure of work and the unfamiliarity of living abroad left me feeling anxious and lonely. When I emailed him about my return date, he uncharacteristically called me back immediately.
Don't come back yet! Or you'll die!
He said urgently. I was momentarily stunned by his sudden outburst. What he told me next was incredibly shocking.
Actually, I was away on a business trip for 2 days, and when I got back, the house had been ransacked. Someone apparently broken through a smashed window.
What? We got robbed.
No, nothing valuable was stolen. But your room was in the worst condition. They said it might have been a crime motivated by revenge.
Since the perpetrator hadn't been caught yet, and there was a danger in returning home, my husband emphasized.
Do not come back now.
Seeing how serious he seemed, I was overcome with anxiety and fear, and I immediately canceled my return flight. Maybe I unknowingly did something to make someone resentful. Being alone in my hotel room, all I could think about were negative thoughts. Desperate to know more about the situation, I called my husband multiple times, but I couldn't reach him. However, when I finally managed to get in touch with my husband, I sensed something was off. When I tried to ask about the house being ransacked, he only talked about work and friends, avoiding the topic entirely. Yet, when I asked if I could return home, he was adamant, saying,
Absolutely not.
Is the police investigation progressing? How long do I have to stay here? I'm anxious being alone.
We don't have detailed information yet. Just stay put until I say it's okay, all right?
His vague responses made me wonder if there was something he couldn't tell me. Maybe he already knew who the perpetrator was and was trying to protect me from the shock. With little information to go on, I was consumed with worry. Later that night, I was further confused by an email from my mother. She said my husband had told her that my work wasn't going well and that there was no definite return date. I couldn't understand why he would lie like that, but I continued the conversation with my mother, not wanting to worry her. Still, waiting for updates while being overseas, clueless about what was happening, was pure agony. I decided I had to see for myself what was going on. Unable to bear it any longer, I decided to return to America without telling my husband. The next day, I secretly returned to America and headed straight home. I will accept whatever happens. It will be all right. I reassured myself as I got out of the taxi in front of the house, only to be shocked to find that it was up for sale. Contrary to what my husband had told me, the house hadn't been ransacked, and the windows weren't broken. I unlocked the front door and cautiously stepped inside, only to find the place completely empty. The furniture we had chosen together, my clothes, and books, all gone. I had mentally prepared myself for danger upon my return, but the reality that greeted me was beyond anything I had imagined. Not understanding what was going on, I knew I needed to find Jason. Since I had returned without telling him, I couldn't ask him directly where he was. Even if I did, I couldn't be sure he would tell me the truth. So, I decided to use my phone's location services to find out where he was. 2 hours later, I found myself in a city adorned with sparkling neon lights. I was keeping watch in front of a certain club when my intoxicated husband stumbled out, supported by a female staff member.
The house is likely to sell for a good price, and with my gloomy crying wife not coming back for a while, I'm free to have the time of my life.
Clearly under the influence, he didn't hold back his loud, cheerful demeanor. The woman linking arms with him asked,
"Are you not going to leave your wife?"
Ha ha.
He crudely laughed it off.
That woman is my cash cow. I'm not letting her go. She'll keep working hard for me from now on.
With those words, he pulled the woman closer by her shoulder. Unable to watch any further, I quickly left the scene, feeling heartbroken and betrayed by the husband I had trusted. Wiping away tears repeatedly, I told myself, no more tears. I have to be strong. Summoning up my courage, I resolved to plan and execute something despite my faltering heart. A week later, in the evening, I headed to the hotel and sat in the lobby, waiting for a certain person. About an hour later, a man in a branded suit and luxury watch arrived and stopped by the reception. Finally, the moment had come. After taking a deep breath and giving myself a slap on the cheek to gather my resolve, and I walked towards him. The man, emanating a strong scent of cologne, visibly startled and took a step back when he saw my face.
What are you doing here?
Waiting for you, Jason. As I approached my husband, he clicked his tongue and glared at me.
Who do you think you are, ignoring my words and coming back home like this?
Meeting after 2 months, those were his first words to me, and my anger reached its peak. How dare you say that? My shout echoed through the hotel lobby, drawing the attention of staff and guests alike. Among them, the most surprised was my husband himself. He looked flustered.
Let's go to the room and talk first.
He grabbed my arm and started walking. I stared daggers at his back in silence. Upon entering the room, my husband threw his bag down and took off his jacket, pushing it towards me. He gestured with his chin for me to hang it up. Who does he think he is, acting all high and mighty at a time like this? He doesn't understand anything. Filled with anger, I threw the jacket back at him defiantly, catching him off guard with my unprecedented rebellious attitude. I came back home to see the truth with my own eyes.
Ha! What are you talking about?
You mentioned before about being a guarantor for your friend. Give me his name, contact information, and workplace. I'll tell him to repay the money quickly. I confronted my husband with a piercing stare. But he looked bewildered, as if he didn't know what I was talking about. It was incredibly painful for me, yet it seemed like something he could easily forget. That realization filled me with unbearable frustration.
Oh.
As if recalling something, he lifted his head and reluctantly loosened his tie. Letting out a deep sigh, he resigned himself.
The thing about being a guarantor for my friend. It was a lie.
He confessed. To my shock, the $20,000 debt turned out to be from my husband's reckless spending.
Unlike you, I have expenses to maintain social connections. Stop dredging up the past.
he defiantly yelled at me, shifting the blame onto me. His words about the past finally broke my patience. The only reason you could repay that debt was because of the money I had saved. I forcefully slammed the nearby table and confronted him. You used my money without permission, never paid me back, and now you're saying it's all in the past? Don't you dare act so self-righteous. Overwhelmed by my outburst, my husband staggered back. I took a deep breath to calm myself down. Then, shall we talk about the $50,000 debt you accumulated while I was away? At those words, my husband turned pale. I sat down on a nearby chair and silently gestured for him to sit across from me. He realized that my demeanor was different from usual, nervously took a seat, and feigned ignorance.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Did you think I only returned to America today?
What? Isn't that the case?
I've been back for some time. I found out you've been using this hotel as your home base by tracking your movements with GPS. I looked at him coldly, and he lowered his head, sweat beading on his forehead. I've had the chance to investigate your activities until today. Taking advantage of my absence due to the overseas business trip, my husband had been frequenting clubs and extravagantly partying with women. Additionally, he had been splurging on expensive limited edition brand items and gambling away money. As a result, in just a month and a half, he had racked up an astounding $50,000 in debt. To cover this debt, he had sold our house without my consent. That house, with its prime location and meticulously designed rooms, was a highly desirable property. Even I, a layperson, knew it would sell quickly. The appraisal of the house exceeded my husband's expectations, prompting him to decide on an immediate sale. However, upon receiving my notification of return, he panicked and lied to prevent it.
Our home has been vandalized and is unsafe.
How exactly did you plan to explain selling the house to me?
I thought I could convince you that a house someone broke into was bad luck, so we should move.
His cunning left me speechless, and I let out a deep sigh. Did you really think you could sell the house without consulting me? Seeing his face pale, I slammed a set of documents from my bag onto the table. He hurriedly grabbed them, and upon reading, fell off his chair.
How? How did this happen?
The documents nullified the house sale contract he had signed. He was visibly shaken, holding his head in disbelief. Too bad your plan didn't work out. He seemed to want to say something, but I ignored him and returned the documents to my bag. The cost of building our house was covered by the money I had saved diligently since my single days, so the house was in my name. For anyone other than the title holder to sell the house, my consent was required. My husband had forged a power of attorney without my consent. Naturally, such a contract was invalid, so I informed the real estate company and took the necessary steps to nullify the sale. Forging a power of attorney is a serious crime. Hearing this, my husband began to tremble. Oh, and there's another crime you're guilty of. My husband had been embezzling money from his company. Whenever his fraud was about to be discovered, he would shift the blame onto his subordinates. One of these subordinates, who had grown suspicious of being repeatedly blamed for things he hadn't done, had found evidence of my husband's wrongdoing.
How? How did this happen?
Your subordinate Harrison is an old classmate of mine. He's a bit clumsy but very serious and responsible. While investigating my husband's activities, I coincidentally reconnected with Harrison. Upon learning each other's situations, we decided to work together. My husband looked shocked, but then quickly scoffed and defied me.
I'm well regarded at the company. I don't know what Harrison found, but no one will believe a guy who's constantly being written up.
When I heard those words, a deep sense of disgust welled up inside me. I couldn't believe he was shifting blame onto a hard-working subordinate without any remorse for his own misconduct. My husband was still sitting on the floor and looked up at me with a sneer. I don't know what you're misunderstanding, but it won't be Harrison who reports you to the company. It's me.
What?
I have the evidence of your misconduct from Harrison, and if I tell them about all the debts you've accumulated, it'll be pretty convincing, won't it? I had already contacted his company, and a meeting with his direct superior was scheduled. The heads of the accounting and HR departments would also be present. Even if my husband tried to talk his way out of it, there was no escaping once the company started a thorough investigation.
You're not serious, right? We're married. You can't do this to me. Just this once. Let it slide, please.
Gone was his arrogant demeanor. He was now crying and clinging to me. This sudden change only fueled my anger. I will never forgive you. I pulled out another piece of paper from my bag and slammed it on the table.
A divorce paper! Wait! If you leave, who's going to pay my debts?
You should repay your own debts. It's only natural. As I scolded him for his foolishness, he hung his head in silence. And since the house contract is void, you need to return the down payment immediately, I demanded. At that moment, my husband turned pale and clutched his head.
But most of the down payment is already gone. How am I supposed to pay it all back?
He stammered. I knew my husband would spend whatever money he had on hand. But that was no longer my concern. I'm not your cash cow. Sign this immediately. I insisted, pushing him to sign the divorce papers. Reluctantly, he did, and I quickly stashed them in my bag. Our marriage, which had felt both long and short, was finally over. Surprisingly, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. You should also be prepared for a police investigation regarding the forged power of attorney. Goodbye. We will never see each other again. Without another glance at him, I walked out of the hotel room. A year later, I learned that my husband had repaid the embezzled funds but was fired from his job, avoiding criminal charges. He had apparently begged his parents for help, and his reputation shifted from being a proud son to a disgrace. Although he wasn't prosecuted for the forged power of attorney, he lost his job and home, left with nothing but significant debt. Now, he lives in constant fear, running from his creditors. As for me, I renovated the house I loved and invited my parents to live with me. The three of us now share a happy home. With another major project on the horizon, I will soon travel abroad again for work. Life is fulfilling, and I cherish every moment spent in my beloved home with the people who matter most.